The blood money was already in his pocket when Thomas Granger rode toward the Lakota camp that moonless night. He'd done this before, burned villages, scattered families, left nothing but ash and silence. The wealthy landowner's orders were simple: eliminate every last soul, no witnesses, no mercy. Thomas felt nothing but cold calculation as he approached the teepees. But when the chief called him into that sacred tent, what he saw sitting in the shadows shattered everything he thought he knew. About himself, about destiny, about the woman who had been haunting his dreams for weeks. Before we continue the story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps us a lot. Then go to the comments and write where you're watching this video from and give your opinion on this story. Now let's get to the story after the intro.
Indigenous West Stories.
Thomas Granger had never questioned the weight of a loaded rifle until that autumn morning when he accepted the contract that would change his soul forever. The weathered bounty hunter sat across from Harrison Blackwood, one of the most powerful landowners in the Dakota Territory, counting the gold coins that clinked softly against the wooden table between them. Each coin represented another Lakota life, another family destroyed, another step toward what Blackwood called progress. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Blackwood's ranch house, casting long shadows across maps marked with red ink, territories to be claimed, obstacles to be removed. Thomas had seen those maps before, had helped clear other lands for men like Blackwood. The Lakota village marked in the Northern Valley was just another problem to solve. Another payday in a life built on violence and survival. Thomas had earned his reputation the hard way. For 15 years, he'd tracked down outlaws, cleared settlements of hostile tribes, and done the dirty work that the army couldn't officially handle. His name was whispered with fear around Lakota campfires, spoken with respect in frontier saloons. He was the man you called when you needed someone eliminated quietly, efficiently, without questions. The Lakota knew him as Ghost Walker, the white man who moved like smoke through their sacred lands, leaving death in his wake. He'd participated in raids that scattered their horse herds, burned their winter supplies, and forced entire families to flee into the harsh wilderness. To Thomas, they were obstacles to civilization, remnants of a dying way of life that stood in the way of progress and prosperity. Blackwood's offer was generous, more gold than Thomas had seen in months. The job seemed straightforward. Gather a small group of reliable men, surround the Lakota camp in the Northern Valley, and ensure that none escape to tell tales or seek revenge. No survivors, no witnesses, no complications. Just another chapter in the endless story of westward expansion. Thomas accepted without hesitation. He'd done worse for less money. But as he rode away from Blackwood's ranch that day, something felt different. The weight of the gold in his saddlebags seemed heavier than usual, and the autumn wind carried an unfamiliar chill that made his horse restless and skittish. Thomas dismissed the feeling as pre-mission nerves, something he'd experienced countless times before. He spent the next week recruiting men for the job. Jake Morrison, a former cavalry sergeant with steady hands and no conscience. Pete Williams, a drifter who'd do anything for whiskey money. Bill Crawford, a young hothead eager to make his reputation. 3 reliable killers who wouldn't ask questions or lose sleep over what they were about to do. The plan was simple. They would approach the Lakota camp under cover of darkness, surround the teepees, and strike at dawn when the tribe was most vulnerable. Thomas had used the strategy before with devastating effectiveness. The Lakota would have no time to organize resistance, no chance to escape into the wilderness they knew so well. But then the dreams began. It started exactly 1 month before the planned attack. Thomas woke in his small cabin outside Deadwood, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. In his dream, he'd been standing in a place he'd never seen before, a sacred space filled with smoke and shadows where time seemed to move differently. And there, sitting calmly in the center of it all, was a woman. She was Lakota. That much was clear from her clothing and the way she wore her long black hair. But everything else about her defied explanation. She didn't speak, didn't move, didn't show fear or anger. She simply looked at him with dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but carried the weight of mountains. "Thomas Granger," she said, and somehow she made his name sound like a prayer and a judgment at the same time. He woke with her voice echoing in his ears, and her image burned into his memory. Thomas tried to dismiss it as nothing more than his mind playing tricks on him. He'd been thinking about the upcoming job, planning strategies and contingencies. It made sense that his subconscious would conjure up images of the people he was about to kill. But the dream came again the next night, and the night after that. For 6 consecutive nights, Thomas found himself in that same sacred space, facing the same mysterious woman. Each dream was more vivid than the last, more real than his waking hours. He could smell the sage burning in the background, feel the soft buffalo hide beneath his feet, hear the distant sound of drums that seemed to beat in rhythm with his own heart. The woman never threatened him, never begged for mercy, never showed any emotion at all. She simply watched him with those penetrating dark eyes, as if she was waiting for something he couldn't understand. Sometimes she would nod slightly, as if acknowledging his presence. Other times she would tilt her head, studying him, like a puzzle she was trying to solve. Thomas had never been a man given to superstition or spiritual beliefs. He'd seen too much death, too much suffering, too much of the harsh reality of frontier life to believe in anything beyond what he could touch and kill. But these dreams shook something deep inside him, something he'd buried beneath years of violence and cynicism. He began drinking more, hoping the whiskey would chase away the visions. He threw himself into preparing for the mission, cleaning his weapons obsessively, studying maps of the Northern Valley until he knew every tree and rock formation. Anything to keep his mind occupied, anything to avoid thinking about the woman who seemed to be calling to him from across some impossible divide. But no matter what he did during the day, she was always there when he closed his eyes at night. By the time Thomas and his men set out for the Northern Valley, he was exhausted and on edge. His companions noticed his unusual quietness, but attributed it to pre-mission focus. They'd worked with him before and knew he was always serious when it came to business. The ride to the Lakota camp took 2 days through increasingly rugged terrain. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape became more beautiful and more forbidding. Ancient pines stretched toward a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and the air grew thin and sharp in their lungs. This was sacred land to the Lakota, Thomas knew, though he'd never understood what that meant before. On the second evening, they made camp in a grove of aspen trees about 5 miles from their target. Thomas sent Pete Williams ahead to scout the Lakota village and report back on numbers, defenses, and the best approach routes. Williams returned just after midnight with disturbing news. "Something ain't right about that camp," Williams reported, his voice tight with unease. "They got sentries posted, sure enough, but they ain't acting like they're expecting trouble. Hell, they ain't acting normal at all. It's like they're waiting for something." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What do you mean, waiting?" "Hard to explain," Williams continued, "but I got close enough to see into the camp, and they're all just sitting around their fires, calm as you please. No kids running around, no women working on hides, no men checking weapons. Just sitting there, staring into the flames like they're watching for something in the smoke." Jake Morrison spat into the fire, sending up a small hiss of steam. "Probably some kind of Indian ceremony. Don't matter none to us what they're doing. Come dawn, they'll all be doing the same thing, bleeding." But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that Williams was right. Something was different about this job, something that went beyond his mysterious dreams and growing unease. The Lakota were known for their fierce resistance to white encroachment, their skill at guerrilla warfare, Their ability to disappear into the wilderness like smoke. They didn't just sit around campfires waiting to die. The men settled in for a few hours of rest before the attack. But Thomas found sleep impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. Calm, patient, knowing. He began to wonder if the dreams were some kind of warning, though he couldn't imagine what they might be warning him about. He'd killed Lakota before without a second thought. Why should this time be any different? As the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the eastern peaks, Thomas roused his men and checked their weapons one final time. They moved through the forest like shadows, using every bit of cover the terrain provided. The Lakota camp lay in a small valley beside a clear stream, surrounded by meadows that would provide no cover for anyone trying to escape. But as they took their positions around the perimeter of the camp, Thomas realized that Williams had been right. The Lakota weren't, acting like people who expected to live through the morning. There was no panic, no hurried preparations for flight or fight. The few people he could see moving around the camp seemed almost serene, as if they were preparing for a ceremony rather than a massacre. Thomas raised his rifle and sighted down the barrel at the largest teepee in the center of the camp. One shot would signal the beginning of the end for these people. His finger tightened on the trigger, and then something impossible happened. An old man emerged from the central teepee and walked directly toward Thomas's hiding place. He moved with the slow dignity of age and authority. And somehow Thomas knew, without being told, that this was the chief, the spiritual leader of the tribe. The old man stopped just 20 yards from where Thomas lay concealed and spoke in clear, unaccented English. "Thomas Granger," the chief said, his voice carrying easily across the morning air. "I have been waiting for you. Will you come and speak with me before you do what you came here to do?" Thomas felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. There was no way the old man could have known where he was hidden, no way he could have known his name. Yet there he stood, patient and unafraid, waiting for an answer. Against every instinct he'd developed over 15 years of survival on the frontier, Thomas found himself standing up and walking toward the Lakota chief. His men would think he'd lost his mind, but something compelled him forward, something stronger than fear or common sense. The chief nodded as Thomas approached, as if he'd known all along that the white man would accept his invitation. "I am Standing Bear," he said simply. "Will you come into my lodge? There is someone who wishes to see you." Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs as he followed the old man toward the central teepee. He could feel the eyes of the entire tribe watching him, but there was no hostility in their gazes, only a strange kind of expectation. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts. Warriors stood with their arms crossed but their weapons sheathed. Elders nodded as if they recognized him. Standing Bear held open the flap of his teepee and gestured for Thomas to enter. The interior was dim and filled with the sweet smoke of burning sage and sweetgrass. Buffalo robes covered the ground and sacred objects hung from the lodge poles: eagle feathers, painted shields, medicine bundles that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. And there, sitting exactly as she had in his dreams, was the woman. Thomas staggered backward as if he'd been struck by lightning. She was real, flesh and blood, not some phantom conjured by his guilty conscience or troubled sleep. She wore a dress of soft doeskin decorated with intricate beadwork, and her long black hair was braided with small bones and feathers. But it was her eyes that held him frozen, the same dark, knowing eyes that had watched him night after night, in his dreams. "This is my daughter, Ayana," Standing Bear said quietly. "Her name means eternal blossom in our language. She has been waiting for you for many seasons, though she did not know your face until the spirits showed it to her in visions." Ayana rose gracefully to her feet and approached Thomas without fear. When she spoke, her voice was the same soft, musical tone he remembered from his dreams, but now it carried the weight of reality. "You have come to destroy us," she said, and it wasn't a question. But you will not because we will fight you. We are too few and you are too skilled in the ways of death. You will not destroy us because something in you has already changed, something you do not yet understand. Thomas tried to speak, tried to deny what she was saying, but no words would come. He felt as if he was drowning in those dark eyes, losing himself in depths he'd never imagined existed. Standing Bear moved to sit beside the small fire in the center of the lodge, and Ayana gestured for Thomas to join them. Against all logic, he found himself sinking down onto a buffalo robe, his rifle forgotten on the ground beside him. "You dream of her," Standing Bear said, and again it wasn't a question. "For many nights she has walked in your sleeping mind, preparing you for this moment. The spirits do not waste their time on those who cannot change, Thomas Granger. They have shown you her face because they see something in you that you have forgotten. About yourself." "I don't understand," Thomas managed to whisper, the first words he'd spoken since entering the lodge. Ayana leaned forward, and Thomas caught the scent of sage and wildflowers in her hair. "You were not always a killer," she said gently. "Once, you were a boy who loved the sound of wind in the trees, who felt wonder at the sight of eagles soaring overhead. That boy still lives inside you, buried beneath years of pain and anger and fear. I have seen him in the spirit world, and he is beautiful." Thomas felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble. "That boy died a long time ago," he said roughly. "I killed him myself." "No," Ayana said with absolute certainty. "You cannot kill what the spirits have blessed. You can only forget it for a while." Standing Bear began to speak in a low, rhythmic voice, telling stories that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth itself. He spoke of the sacred connection between all living things, of the responsibility each person had to protect and nurture the web of life that bound everything together. He talked about the power of choice, the possibility of redemption, the courage required to walk away from a path of destruction. As the old man spoke, Thomas felt the walls around his heart continuing to crumble. Memories he'd buried for decades began to surface. His mother's gentle hands as she tended their small garden, his father's patient voice as he taught him to read, the sense of wonder he'd felt as a child, watching the changing seasons paint the landscape in different colors. When had he lost all of that? When had he become the kind of man who could take money to murder families in their sleep? Ayana reached out and touched his hand, and Thomas felt a jolt of electricity run up his arm. Her skin was warm and soft, more real than anything he'd experienced in years of violence and death. "You can choose differently," she said simply. "Right. Now in this moment you can choose to be the man you were meant to be, instead of the man you have become." Thomas looked into her eyes and saw his own reflection there. Not the hardened killer he'd become, but the lost boy he'd once been. The man he might still become if he had the courage to try. Outside the lodge, he could hear his men growing restless, probably wondering why he hadn't given the signal to attack. In a few minutes, they might decide to start the massacre without him. The thought filled him with a horror so profound it took his breath away. "I have to stop them," he said, starting to rise. Standing, Bear placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Yes," the old chief said, "but first, you must choose. Not just for this moment, but for all the moments that will follow. Who do you wish to be, Thomas Granger?" Thomas looked around the sacred lodge, at the symbols of a way of life he'd spent years trying to destroy, at the old man who should have been his enemy, but felt more like a father, at the woman who had somehow reached across the divide between dreams and reality to touch his soul. "I don't know how to be anyone else," he admitted. Ayana smiled for the first time since he'd entered the lodge, and it was like watching the sun rise over the mountains. "Then we will teach you," she said. Thomas stumbled out of the lodge into the bright morning sunlight, his mind reeling with everything he'd experienced. His men were positioned around the camp, waiting for his signal, their fingers on their triggers. In a few seconds, he could give the order that would turn this peaceful valley into a killing ground. Instead, he raised his hand and made the signal for withdrawal. Jake Morrison emerged from his hiding place with a confused expression. "What's the problem, boss? We got them dead to rights." "Change of plans," Thomas said, his voice steadier than he felt. "The job's off." "What do you mean, off?" Pete Williams demanded. "We rode all this way for nothing?" Thomas looked back at the Lakota camp, where people were beginning to emerge from their lodges to watch the white men with curious but unafraid eyes. "I mean, we're leaving. Now." The ride back to Deadwood was tense and uncomfortable. His men peppered him with questions he couldn't answer, accusations he couldn't deny. By the time they reached town, word had already spread that Thomas Granger had lost his nerve, that the famous Indian killer had gone soft. Harrison Blackwood was waiting for him at the saloon, his face red with fury. "What the hell happened out there, Granger? I paid you good money to solve a problem, and that problem is still breathing." Thomas set the bag of gold coins on the bar between them. "Keep your money. Find someone else to do your dirty work." Blackwood's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You're making a big mistake, Granger. Bigger than you know. That land is going to be mine, one way or another. And if you're not with me, you're against me." "Then, I guess I'm against you," Thomas said quietly. He left Deadwood that same day, riding north toward the mountains with nothing but his horse, his weapons, and a growing certainty that his life had just taken a turn he couldn't have imagined. He had no plan, no destination, no idea what he was going to do next. All he knew was that he couldn't go back to being the man he'd been before he looked into Ayana's eyes. For 3 weeks, Thomas wandered the wilderness, living off the land and trying to make sense of what had happened to him. He'd given up a lucrative career, made a powerful enemy, and abandoned everything he'd thought he knew about himself. For what? A woman he'd met in dreams, a moment of connection in a smoky lodge, the possibility that he might be something more than a killer. When he finally returned to the Lakota camp, he came on foot, his weapons left behind, his hands empty and open. The sentries saw him coming from miles away, but made no move to stop him. They simply watched as he walked slowly down into the valley, his head held high despite the uncertainty churning in his gut. Standing Bear was waiting for him beside the stream that ran through the center of the camp. The old chief's weathered face showed no surprise, as if he'd known all along that Thomas would return. "You have come back," Standing Bear observed. "I don't know why," Thomas admitted. "I don't know what I'm doing here. You are learning to listen to your heart instead of your fear." "The chief replied, "It is the first step on a very long journey." The Lakota did not welcome Thomas with open arms. They remembered too well the villages he'd helped destroy, the families he'd scattered, the blood he'd spilled in service of men like Harrison Blackwood. Children ran away when they saw him coming. Mothers pulled their little ones close. Warriors watched him with hands never far from their weapons. But Ayana was different. She seemed to see past the man he'd been to the man he might become, and slowly, patiently, she began to teach him what that might look like. She showed him how to sit quietly by the stream and listen to the voice of the water as it flowed over the stones. She taught him the names of the plants that grew in the meadows, their uses for healing and ceremony. She helped him understand that the land wasn't something to be conquered and owned, but something to be cherished and protected for future generations. It wasn't easy. Thomas had spent so many years building walls around his heart that tearing them down was like performing surgery on himself without anesthesia. There were days when he wanted to run, to go back to the simple brutality of his old life, where everything was clear and nothing required him to feel. But Ayana was always there, patient and understanding, helping him through the dark moments when the weight of his past threatened to crush him. She never asked him to forget what he'd done or pretend it hadn't happened. Instead, she helped him understand that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about choosing to create a different future. Slowly, grudgingly, the tribe began to accept his presence. It started with the children, who were naturally curious about the strange white man who sat by the stream for hours at a time, watching the clouds drift across the sky. Then the women began to nod to him when he passed, acknowledging his efforts to learn their ways. Finally, even some of the warriors began to include him in their conversations, testing his knowledge of the land and his commitment to their people. Thomas learned to speak Lakota, to participate in their ceremonies, to understand the complex spiritual beliefs that governed their relationship with the natural world. He discovered that everything was connected: the earth and sky, the animals and plants, the living and the dead, the past and future. It was a way of seeing that transformed everything he thought he knew about existence. But his past wasn't finished with him yet. 6 months after Thomas had first walked away from the massacre in the valley, Harrison Blackwood made good on his threats. Unable to hire another group willing to take on the Lakota directly, he'd gone to the territorial government with claims that the tribe was harboring a dangerous fugitive and planning attacks on white settlements. The cavalry arrived on a cold morning in early spring. 2 companies of soldiers led by a captain who'd made his reputation, fighting Apache in Arizona. They surrounded the camp just as Thomas and his men had done months before, but this time there would be no talking, no last-minute changes of heart. Thomas was gathering firewood when he heard the thunder of hoofbeats and the jingle of cavalry equipment. He dropped the wood and ran toward the camp, his heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt since childhood. By the time he reached the edge of the valley, the soldiers had already taken positions around the perimeter. Captain Morrison, no relation to the Jake Morrison who'd once worked for Thomas, rode into the center of the camp under a flag of truce. His voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air as he delivered his ultimatum. By order of the territorial government, this illegal gathering is hereby ordered to disperse. You have 1 hour to pack your belongings and leave this area. Anyone remaining after that time will be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly. Standing Bear emerged from his lodge with the dignity of a man who'd faced death many times before. "This is our home," he said simply. "Our ancestors are buried in this soil. We will not leave." "Then you'll die here," Morrison replied coldly. "The choice is yours." Thomas knew he had to act, but he also knew that anything he did would probably result in his own death. The soldiers would recognize him as a white man living among the Indians, which automatically made him a traitor in their eyes. But as he looked around the camp at the people who'd become his family, at Ayanna standing beside her father with her chin raised in defiance, he realized that some things were worth dying for. He walked out into the open space between the soldiers and the tribe, his hands raised to show he was unarmed. Captain Morrison's eyes widened with recognition. Thomas Granger's reputation had reached even the regular army. "Well, well," Morrison said with a cold smile, "the famous Indian killer living among his former. Pray, how the mighty have fallen." "These people have done nothing wrong," Thomas said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "They're not planning any attacks. They're not harboring fugitives. They just want to live in peace on land that's been theirs for generations." Morrison laughed harshly. "Land that belongs to the United States government now, Granger, and they're harboring the biggest fugitive of all, you. Harrison Blackwood has put a substantial bounty on your head, dead or alive." Thomas felt the pieces clicking into place. Blackwood hadn't just wanted the Lakota removed from their land. He'd wanted revenge on the man who'd defied him. This whole military operation was as much about capturing Thomas as it was about clearing the valley. "Let them go," Thomas said. "I'm the one you want. Take me and let the tribe leave in peace." "I don't think so," Morrison replied. "My orders are to clear this entire area, and that's what I'm going to do. But I'll tell you what, surrender now, and I'll make sure the killing is quick and clean. Keep playing Indian, and I'll let my boys have some fun before they finish the job." Thomas looked back at the Lakota camp. at the faces of people who'd shown him what it meant to live with honor and dignity. He thought about the man he'd been when he first rode into this valley, ready to murder families for money. That man seemed like a stranger now, someone he'd known in another lifetime. Ayana stepped forward to stand beside him, her hand slipping into his with a gesture that spoke louder than words. One by one, the other members of the tribe joined them. Standing bare, the warriors, the women, even the children. They formed a human wall between the soldiers and their homes, ready to face whatever came together. Captain Morrison's face darkened with anger. "You've got 5 minutes to reconsider, Granger. After that, we start shooting." But Thomas wasn't listening anymore. He was looking into Ayana's eyes, seeing the same calm acceptance he'd first witnessed in his dreams. She wasn't afraid, wasn't angry, wasn't desperate. She was simply present, fully committed to this moment and whatever it might bring. "I love you," he said quietly, the words coming from some deep place he hadn't known existed. She smiled and squeezed his hand. "I know," she said. "I have always known." The next few minutes passed like hours as the soldiers checked their weapons and prepared for the massacre to come. Thomas could see the fear in some of the younger troopers' faces. They'd signed up to fight warriors, not to gun down families standing hand in front of their homes. Then, just as Morrison raised his hand to give the order to fire, a new sound echoed across the valley. The thunder of many horses approaching fast. Thomas turned to see a sight that made his heart leap with hope and terror in equal measure. Riding down from the northern ridge came what looked like half the Lakota nation, hundreds of warriors in full war. Faint, their war cries echoing off the canyon walls like the voices of ancient gods. At their head rode a chief Thomas recognized from wanted posters, Crazy Horse himself, the legendary war leader who'd never been defeated in battle. The cavalry horses began to dance and rear as the war party swept down into the valley like an avalanche of fury and determination. Captain Morrison's face went white as he realized his 2 companies were suddenly outnumbered 3-1 by some of the finest light cavalry in the world. But Crazy Horse didn't order an attack. Instead, he rode directly to where Thomas and the others stood, his painted face grim with purpose. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who'd spent his life defending his people. "Captain," he said in perfect English, "you have made a mistake. This valley is protected by treaty, signed by your own government. These people have committed no crimes, broken no laws. If you attack them, you attack all the Lakota nation." Morrison's hand moved toward his sidearm, but the sound of hundreds of rifles being cocked made him freeze. He was trapped, outnumbered, and facing the most feared war chief on the plains. Any move he made could trigger a battle that would end with his entire command wiped out. "This isn't over," Morrison said finally, his voice tight with frustrated rage. "Blackwood has friends in Washington. We'll be back with more men, more authority." Crazy Horse nodded calmly. "When you return, we will be waiting. But think carefully, Captain. Is this valley worth the lives of all your soldiers? Is one white man's greed worth starting a war that will consume everything in its path?" The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, Morrison gave the order to withdraw, and the cavalry rode out of the valley with their tails between their legs. But Thomas knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Blackwood wouldn't give up, and eventually he'd find a way to get what he wanted. That night, as the tribe celebrated their narrow escape, Crazy Horse pulled Thomas aside for a private conversation. The war chief studied him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Standing Bear tells me you have chosen to walk the red road," Crazy Horse said, "that you have turned away from the path of destruction to follow the way of life. Is this true?" "I'm trying," Thomas replied honestly. "I'm not sure I know how to be anything other than what I was." Crazy Horse nodded slowly. "The spirits do not call the qualified, Thomas Granger. They qualify the called. You have been chosen for something greater than your past, something that will require all the courage you once used for killing. What do you mean? The war chief gazed out across the valley where campfires twinkled like stars in the gathering darkness. Change is coming to our people, whether we want it or not. The old ways are dying, and we must find new ways to survive, without losing who we are. You understand both worlds, the world of the white man and the world of the Lakota. Perhaps you can help us build a bridge between them. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. I don't know if I'm strong enough for something like that. Strength is not about never falling down, Crazy Horse replied. It is about getting back up every time you fall. You have already proven you have that kind of strength. Over the following months, Thomas threw himself into learning everything he could about Lakota culture, history, and spirituality. He participated in vision quests that left him changed at the cellular level, learned to read the signs and omens that spoke of the future, discovered healing techniques that worked on the spirit as well as the body. And through it all, Ayanna was his guide and companion, helping him navigate the complex transformation from killer to healer, from destroyer to protector. Their relationship deepened slowly, built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than simple attraction. In the Lakota way, courtship was a serious matter that involved the entire community. Thomas had to prove himself worthy not just to Ayanna, but to her father, her extended family, and the tribe as a whole. He participated in hunts to show he could provide, demonstrated his growing spiritual understanding in ceremonies, and gradually earned the trust of people who had every reason to hate him. Standing Bear watched this process with the patience of a man who understood that some changes couldn't be rushed. When he finally gave his blessing for Thomas and Ayanna to marry, it felt like a victory that had been years in the making. The wedding ceremony took place during the summer solstice, when the sun stood highest in the sky and the power of life was at its peak. Thomas and Ayanna exchanged vows in the traditional way, pledging to walk together through all the seasons of their lives, to support each other through joy and sorrow, to raise their children with respect for both the earth and the sky. As part of the ceremony, Thomas received a new name, Wikapi Najin, which meant standing star. It was a name that honored his journey from darkness to light, his transformation from a man who brought death to one who brought hope. But their happiness was shadowed by the knowledge that Harrison Blackwood hadn't given up his plans for the valley. Reports reached them regularly of his efforts to build political support for another military action, his attempts to bribe officials and spread lies about the tribe's activities. The final confrontation came in the autumn of Thomas's second year with the Lakota. Blackwood arrived with a full regiment of cavalry, a company of artillery, and a legal document that supposedly gave him the right to claim the valley for development purposes. This time, there would be no negotiation, no last-minute reprieve. But Thomas and the tribe were ready for him. Over the months since the first attack, they'd been busy building alliances with other tribes, gathering evidence of Blackwood's illegal activities and reaching out to sympathetic voices in the territorial government. When the showdown finally came, it wasn't just the Lakota who stood against Blackwood's forces. A coalition of tribes had gathered in the valley, Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and others who'd decided that this was where they would make their stand. More importantly, they'd been joined by a group of white settlers, army officers, and government officials who'd grown disgusted with Blackwood's methods and the corruption he represented. The legal battle was as fierce as any fought with weapons. Thomas, drawing on knowledge he'd gained from years of dealing with frontier law, helped present evidence of Blackwood's fraudulent land claims, his bribes to government officials, and his illegal use of military forces for personal gain. When the Saiji dust finally settled, it was Blackwood who found himself facing charges, his political allies abandoning him as quickly as they'd once supported him. The valley was officially recognized as sovereign Lakota territory, protected by federal treaty and immune from future development schemes. Thomas and Ayana's first child was born the following spring, a daughter they named Wikapi Win, Star Woman. As Thomas held his baby girl for the first time, feeling her tiny fingers wrap around his weathered thumb, he marveled at the journey that had brought him to this moment. He thought about the man he'd been when he first rode into this valley with murder in his heart and gold in his pocket. That man seemed like someone from another lifetime, someone he'd known in a dream that had turned into a nightmare before finally becoming something beautiful. Standing Bear, now a grandfather, performed the naming ceremony for the baby with hands that shook slightly with age, but eyes that still burned with the fire of ancient wisdom. As he lifted the child toward the four directions, offering her to the spirits of earth and sky, Thomas felt a completeness he'd never imagined possible. "She will grow up in a world we can only dream of," Ayana whispered, as they watched their daughter sleep in her cradleboard. "A world where the red road and the white road can walk side by side." Thomas nodded, understanding that his transformation was just the beginning of a larger change that would ripple out through generations yet unborn. He'd been hired to eliminate the Lakota tribe, but instead, they'd eliminated the killer in him and helped him find the man he was meant to be. Years passed, and Thomas, now known throughout the territory as Standing Star, became a bridge between two worlds that had seemed destined for eternal conflict. He helped negotiate treaties that protected tribal lands while allowing for peaceful coexistence with white settlers. He established schools where Lakota children could learn both their traditional ways and the skills they'd need to navigate the changing world. Most importantly, he and Ayana raised their children, 3 daughters and 2 sons, to understand that they carried the best of both cultures in their blood, that they were living proof that love could triumph over hatred, that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to seek it. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep, Thomas would sometimes sit by the stream that ran through the valley and remember the dreams that had started it all. He'd think about the woman who'd reached across the divide between sleeping and waking to touch his soul, who'd seen something worth saving in a man who'd forgotten how to save himself. The water whispered secrets as it flowed over the stones, carrying stories of transformation and renewal, of second chances and the power of love to change even the hardest heart. And Thomas would smile, knowing that he'd been blessed beyond measure, that he'd found his way home to a place he'd never known he was looking for. He'd come to destroy a people and ended up being reborn among them. He'd traded a life of violence for one of peace, a heart of stone for one of flesh, a future of emptiness for one filled with love and purpose. It was, he thought as he watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky, the best deal he'd ever made.